I'm from the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, which is the office that was charged with the creation of plaNYC, which is the city's long-term sustainability plan that looks to the year 2030. And once that plan was created and released in April of 2007, we're now that office that is implementing it. And the plan consists of 127 different initiatives addressing air quality, water quality, climate change, and of course, energy efficiency. And one of the first pieces of that plan was to really do a breakdown of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And when we did that a few years ago, we realized New York is pretty unique in that sense, that a majority of our greenhouse gases, about 75% at this point, back then it was around 78% of our greenhouse gases, are coming from our buildings. So this was something that we had to look at differently than the rest of the city, where in other countries they're focusing on transportation, where people are driving to and from work. We here in New York spend our time living in buildings, walking to our buildings, and that's where we're using most of our energy. So when we were looking at our greenhouse gas reduction plan, the font came out a little funny, we noticed that the biggest piece of our wedge to reach our 30% reduction would have to come from more efficient buildings. And if you can't read that, that's about 16.5 million metric tons. So addressing that wedge is what myself and the energy team in our office has been working on in the last few years. And the way we did that was through two big efforts. One, the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, which is what I'm going to go into detail about today, which is to address our existing buildings, which is really important because by the year 2030, 85% of those buildings that exist then are the buildings that already exist now. So to target that 75% greenhouse gas emissions, we really needed to focus on the buildings that we have right now. As for the other 15%, we've been working on the Green Codes Task Force, which is looking at our building codes, which I'll also touch upon on the end. And that's how we're really addressing new construction. So as I mentioned, the Greener Greater Buildings Plan, which was actually passed and signed into law in December of last year. It's no longer a plan, it's actually legislation. It consists of 4 bills and then 2 non-legislative components. And I'm going to walk you through each of those pieces. So the first thing that we had to do was create a New York City Energy Code. Prior to this, New York City had control of all our construction codes, the building code, the fire code, the plumbing code. The one code that wasn't in the city's control was the energy code. We followed the New York State Energy Code. And the New York State Energy Law allows any municipality to adopt its own code as long as it's more stringent than the state's. So we thought, hey, that's a great thing to do. Why don't we adopt our own code? And the way we made ours more stringent was by getting rid of a loophole that the state code has, which says that if you're renovating less than 50% of a system or a subsystem, you don't need to use the rules of the energy code, which is almost always the case in this city because you're renovating floor by floor, tenant space by tenant space, and you're almost never renovating 50% of a building. Look at the Empire State Building. That's floor by floor. They're not doing the whole building at more than 50% at once, so they would not have to abide by the rules of the energy code. So also to note that New York State uses the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code, which is what 42 states in this country also use. But we were the only state that had this 50% loophole. So New York City removed that loophole, and by doing that, we made the energy code more stringent, and we're able to adopt our own energy code. Turns out, the state, in order to receive federal stimulus money for energy efficiency, has to have a more stringent code. So it looks like they're going to be following New York City and doing the same thing by the end of the year. They weren't moving as quickly as we'd like, so the New York City Energy Code goes into effect July 1st. And the Department of Buildings is in the process of developing rules. In some cases, it's very easy to apply the energy code. If you're replacing a window, you need to put in a code-compliant window. But there are some instances where if you're, let's say, cutting a hole in the wall, so you need to put insulation just in that hole to meet the requirements of the energy code. So those are the type of the things that the Department of Building is working on to make sure that once the code is implemented for all practices, that it'll run smoothly. Now the next 3 pieces of legislation all deal with a different subset of buildings. The energy code applies to any building of any size, any type. These 3 bills all apply to buildings over 50,000 square feet. And there was a reason that we started with the largest buildings in the city. First of all, the 50,000 square feet cutoff is a great stat for this city. It's only 2% of our city's buildings, but makes up about half of the city's square footage. So we're getting a small amount of buildings, but half of the city's space. So it's really targeting a small amount, but getting a big bang for your buck. The other thing about these buildings is that they account for about 45% of our city's energy consumption. So that 2% of buildings is about half of the building's energy use. So we decided that the biggest buildings, it's a small group to start with, and these buildings are also more sophisticated. A lot of them have hired management staff, they have a full-time engineer, and they would be more capable to implement the next 3 bills. And the first of those 3 bills that are going to apply to these large buildings is annual benchmarking, which is measuring your building's energy and, for New York City, water consumption, using the EPA's tool called Portfolio Manager. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Energy Star buildings. When a building's an Energy Star building, it means it received a rating of 75 or higher using the EPA's Portfolio Manager tool. We're not requiring any building to receive any specific type of score or anything of that nature. We're just asking these buildings to start measuring their energy consumption so they could start to be more aware of how much these buildings are actually using. The more sophisticated buildings already, they know, they're keeping track of it, but there are many buildings out there that have no idea how well or poorly they're performing. It's the classic example when you're going to buy a car. You want to know the miles per gallon of that car to know how efficiently that car is going to run on the road. The same should apply to a building. When you're renting, purchasing, or living in a building, you should want to know how efficient that building is. So the tool asks for a building owner to input all its energy use and then specific building information such as building square footage, hours of use, occupancy type, and things like that. And then magically out pops a couple of different indicators. One is your energy utilization index, which tells you how much energy used per square foot. If the building's a rateable space, you'll get that Energy Star score from 1 to 100. We're also asking people to start benchmarking water once they have the AMRs, the automatic meter readers, that are being installed by the Department of Environmental Protection. That way, the water information can be automatically uploaded to the tool so people could start to learn about their water consumption as well. This is going to apply to that group of large buildings, but because of people's lack of experience with the tool, there's a staggered implementation. So this May, the city is well underway to almost completing benchmarking our approximately 4,000 buildings. We've already completed the 1,300 schools into the benchmarking tool. Then, starting next May, all of the private sector buildings will have to start benchmarking. And the interesting part is that we're going to start disclosing this information to the public. And where we're posting this information is on the Department of Finance's assessment roll. That's where anybody in the public can go and look up individual buildings' tax information, all the public finance information that's available. And we see that this is a nice synergy to start to keep the energy information with the financial information, because people need to start valuing energy efficiency as part of the whole package. So there you would be able to find the building's energy utilization index, the water use per square foot, and a rating if available, all posted publicly. There's going to be also a little bit of a delay for that. Next year we'll post the information for the city buildings, the following year for the commercial buildings, and then the year after for residential. Mostly because the tool is fairly new for residential building owners. They're not as familiar with it. So we're giving them a couple more years to get used to using it and correcting any errors they might have had with inputting the data. So we're also working actually with the EPA to bring some trainings here to New York City to start teaching people how to benchmarking. And you'll already see a lot of the private real estate companies are now advertising that they can help you benchmark your building, and that's great. Today, REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, is hosting a benchmarking training this afternoon, actually, for residential building members, because they're the ones who aren't as familiar with the tool, because a lot of their commercial members have already been using it. The next piece of legislation, I'm sure many of you have heard about it. You might have read the Times article on it. It got some good press. It's one of the most unique pieces of our energy package that's unique to New York. This bill is going to require the same group of large buildings over 50,000 square feet to conduct an energy audit and perform retro-commissioning once every 10 years. An energy audit is really just an assessment of how the building's performing and recommendations to make the building more energy efficient. It's more identifying upgrades to the building. So an audit might recommend replacing a boiler. Retro-commissioning, on the other hand, is more of operations and maintenance and fine-tuning of the building systems that you already have in place. So instead of recommending to replace your boiler, it would recommend to tune and clean your boiler. So because there was a lot of controversy in the original introduction of the bill, we had retrofits, which would be the recommendations that come from the audits. The original bill said to implement all retrofits that pay for themselves within 5 years. That piece was removed, and we had a more explicit explanation of the retro-commissioning process. So the legislation actually goes through a lot of different things that you need to require. Here's an example. And the building doesn't necessarily need to do these if they're already performing properly. So if the HVAC system is already tuned and they have a good maintenance staff and they keep it up to date, then check, that's done. If, however, it's not in working order, that's what the building's required to do. It's to bring it up to speed. It's a doctor checkup once every year to make sure the building's performing properly. So let's see, and it's a rotating schedule. It's done by the last digit of your borough, block, and lot according to year. So let's say your lot number ends in 7, you would become due in 2017. So it's going to be rotated on a 10-year cycle, but there's a lot of detail in the bill about early compliance. So let's say a building owner was really eager and they wanted to do their audit and retro-commissioning today, but they weren't due till 2020. They have the option to comply with the first round of buildings due in 2013. And there's a lot of rules laid out for those buildings for early compliance in terms of who's qualified to perform the energy audit, who has to sign off on the audit, who's, again, qualified to do the retro-commissioning, and who needs to sign off to make sure that it's of a high quality and meeting the standards. And over the next year or so, the Department of Buildings is going to be writing the rules, a more detailed explanation of the type of auditors and retro-commissioners qualified to do this type of work. So the last piece of legislation in our package is for lighting upgrades and submetering. And this bill is a little different than the others is because this one is really targeting the tenant space, whereas the audits and retro-commissioning was only looking at a building's base building systems, just the ones that the owner owned and operated. This gets into the tenant space. And this is how we were able to sort of navigate our way through the split incentive issue, which is what was so problematic about the retrofits. Building owners didn't want to pay for an upgrade where the tenant received the energy savings benefits and vice versa. So lighting upgrades are required by the year 2025 within the entire building space. That gives an owner 15 years to look at its building and decide how they want to handle the upgrades. It could be done at tenant turnover, at the time a lease is re-signed. They could be doing it at the time of construction, whatever works best. That's why we chose the 15-year time period, because in that period, most leases will have either turned over or expired. So it's ample time for an entire building to upgrade. And what I mean by upgrade is by increasing the efficiency of the lighting in the building to meet the current standards of the energy code. So the lighting upgrade would only have to happen once to meet the standards of the energy code over the next 15 years. That doesn't mean that every time the energy code changes that the lighting would have to be upgraded. It's just once. And this is actually a really significant change. Even if the building was built last year, brand new, state-of-the-art, LEED building with lighting, upgrading it to the current energy code is actually an improvement, because the energy code, I think in April of last year or even the year before, the lighting standards became 30% more stringent. And lighting is on a fast-paced track to continually becoming more stringent. And lighting is one of those retrofits that have a really quick payback, so it's beneficial to the owner and the tenant. The other piece of this bill that was added after it was introduced was a submetering component. And this is to help really start to get at that the split incentive issue. What's required is that owners of these buildings are going to have to install a submeter for tenants larger than 10,000 square feet, or for floor spaces that are larger than 10,000 square feet. And they're going to have to start providing those tenants with their energy information. It is not requiring the building owners to charge using the submeter, just providing the energy use. Because right now, a lot of tenants are paying a flat fee on a square foot basis and have no idea how much energy they're using. And this one, building owners are actually in favor, because it's for those tenants that leave their lights on 24 hours a day, leave their copiers running, their computers on. Yep, sure.
Just a related question on that. Are the utilities within New York working to do more demand response energy or real-time billing? Is sort of in relation to that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Con Ed has put in a request in terms of real-time billing for the next portfolio standard, so it's something that they are working on. I know there's a lot of subsidies for lighting upgrades and things like that, so we have been working with the utilities, and I'll talk about that when we get to the financing. So, and that's a submetering component, and that's really, just like the benchmarking is an educational tool for the public, submetering is really an educational tool for the tenants, so they can start to see how much they're using. And eventually, over time, one would assume that the building owners and the tenants would start billing for actual energy consumption. So those are the 4 pieces of legislation. We could do questions now or wait to the end. If anyone has a dying question, then let's keep going and we'll go through it. The other big piece that I'm sure all of you are talking about is green jobs. Everyone's talking about the next wave of the working class is green jobs, and we know that's true, and especially with these 4 bills, they're creating jobs. So we created, it's a terrible name, the Green Building Workforce Development Working Group. Someone needs to rethink that name. That consisted of a lot of the key players in the city, NYSERDA, the Real Estate Board, the unions, CUNY Saturday, I'm not sure if NYU, they might have been a part of this. And this was really, in the initial phases of this working group, they helped us really nail down the qualifications we would need for the people conducting the energy audits, performing the retro-commissioning, and who out there right now is capable of doing that work. So in the bill, you'll see a series of certifications that one is required to have in order to perform the audits. And that's sort of our placeholder in the time being. And over the next few years, we're working to ramp up the number of people right now in New York that hold those certifications. For example, a CEM, a Certified Energy Manager, is one of the certifications that qualify to conduct an energy audit. So next week, actually, the Association of Energy Engineers is bringing a CEM training with the help of NYSERDA to reduce the cost here in New York. They do them all over the country, and we're hoping that over the next year we can really ramp up the number of people that hold these different certifications. The next thing that we're going to be doing with the work of this group is to really look at the different types of training programs that are currently offered in the city, work with the different educational institutions and see where curriculums can be developed so people have a better understanding of the energy code. We have over 10,000 people in this city specifically focused on lighting, the lighting designers, electricians. A good deal of those have no idea what it means to do a lighting upgrade, a lighting retrofit. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the sensors and controls. I'm sure you've all been in rooms where someone has put a tape over the occupancy sensor because people want to leave the lights on or they don't want to turn off the lights or something of that nature. Really training those 10,000 lighting designers on the proper way to install controls and sensors is going to be a big deal to really achieve the energy savings of the lighting upgrades over the next 15 years. So that's the workforce piece that we've been working on. The last piece is financing. It's always everyone's big concern. And in most cases, we point to NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. They are the state's funding pool for energy efficiency measures. Everyone who pays the SBC charge, the service benefit charge on their energy bill, is contributing to the NYSERDA pool, and everyone is welcome to have that money come back to them for energy savings. We can't touch that. The city, that's the state. The 2 things that the city is, however, working on is a revolving loan fund. We applied for the maximum amount of stimulus funding, and we received that. Unfortunately, that's only about $16 million right now that we received from the federal government to set up this loan. And what it would be a loan fund set up, and people would take out loans to install those energy retrofits we discussed and paid back through the energy savings. This isn't something that's typically done. A lot of the private banks, when we started talking to them about 2 years ago, were interested. A lot of them slowly lost interest, but that's picking up again, and a lot of people just aren't familiar or aware of how the energy savings are going to pay back for the loan. So we think that the city's revolving loan fund could really serve as a model and help the private banks start to tread into this area. The other piece, which was mentioned earlier, is the PACE financing that the federal government approved and then the state passed legislation allowing people to pay back energy retrofits through their property taxes. There's a lot to be done on this. I have to be familiar. I'm not working on financing in my office, so there's a lot that I'm not currently up to date on. I know the state legislation needs some revisions. The city needs to pass legislation, but we're hoping that this will be in effect by early fall. So hopefully it can be up and running by the end of the summer. And these are the 2 financing pieces that the city is truly involved in.
So I know this isn't your area of expertise, but you're saying this PACE financing, is that for any building owner or only buildings over 50,000?
No, that would be for any building.
Any building owner? Mm-hmm. There's no...
Right now there's a similar model in Babylon, which is a suburb in Long Island, a town in Long Island, and they're using it residential homes, and that's a really small.
And is it only for efficiency improvements that meet certain criteria, or?
The PACE financing is separate than the legislation. It doesn't have to mean that you're using it to pay for the lighting upgrades. It could be for anything that you're doing in terms of energy efficiency, regardless of the 4 bills. So just to give you an idea of what we think this package will do, right now, and it's originally estimated, we think it was about a 4.75 reduction in carbon emissions in the city. We think that's a really conservative estimate, and this is the single largest piece of plaNYC that's going to get at our 30% reduction. So it's really tackling at our emissions, and we've already seen improvements in the past year. The other thing it's going to do, of course, is going to save New Yorkers money on their energy bills and create jobs, like we said, about 17,000 construction-related jobs through the lighting upgrades, the installation of sub-meters, the auditors, retro-commissioners, et cetera. Oh, yep.
So 4.75, that's conservative, so that's just done, let's say 10? And we're trying to reduce it by 30?
30.
Biggest component, how do we get there?
By a lot of things. So there's 127 different initiatives. The Green Codes Task Force, we actually just started calculating those CO2 reductions, and that's going to most likely replace us in terms of the biggest single reduction, and there's big pieces. But we have all our efforts in terms of transportation and our fleets and things like that that we're working on. So now I just wanted to touch on the Green Codes Task Force. This was that original pie I showed you, how 85% of our existing buildings, we still need to get after that 15% of new construction that's going to happen over the next few years until 2030. What the Green Codes Task Force's task was to look at the city's building codes, construction codes, anything that touches construction in New York City, and see how we could green construction. And what we meant by that was really remove impediments that were holding people up from doing more sustainable practices, and then also add improvements to our codes to make them more stringent in terms of efficiency. So in July of 2008, Mayor Bloomberg and Speaker Quinn convened a task force. At this point, it was over about 200 volunteers that helped work on this. They spent about a year combing through the codes, making recommendations, drafting code language, providing examples, and on February 1st of this year, published a final document. You could go to Urban Green Council's website and download the full report or the really jazzy executive summary with the pictures, which is a lot nicer and a much easier read. And these 111 proposals were then handed over to the mayor and the speaker in February. And now the city is going to start going through these proposals and looking at them one by one and seeing which ones we could actually incorporate into our codes. And it was actually fairly interesting because the same week and time that we were receiving this report that was put together by Urban Green Council, the New York chapter of the USGBC, the International Construction Codes, the ICC, released their green construction code last Monday. ASHRAE created their green code, ASHRAE 189.1, and then California also has a green code. So it's all just happening at the same time, and it just goes to show that greening your codes is really the most cost-effective and efficient way to start to really green new construction. It's bringing up the baseline, whereas a building designing to lead is at the forefront and they are already ahead of the curve. We need to use our codes to really bring up the rear of the people who aren't meeting those standards. So that's our big effort for the codes. And I think maybe now we should turn it over to questions.